Between 2009 and 2013, every single Mossad spy embedded inside Iran's nuclear program vanished. Not one at a time. Not in a dramatic raid, they simply stopped responding. 23 human sources, recruited over half a decade, spread across 6 Iranian cities, gone. Phones silent, dead drops untouched, encrypted messages unanswered. No intelligence agency has ever officially confirmed what happened to them. No government has released a list of names. No memorial exists. What remains are fragments, court documents leaked years later, defector testimonies that contradict each other, and a handful of execution announcements buried in Iranian state media that matched profiles no one in Tel Aviv wanted to acknowledge. This story begins not in Tehran and not in Tel Aviv. It begins in a small electronics repair shop on Zand Avenue in Shiraz, with a man we will call Dariush, who had no idea he was about to become the first thread pulled from a web that would unravel across an entire country. Dariush was 41 years old. He had a wife named Nasrin, 2 daughters in secondary school, and a reputation in his neighborhood as the man who could fix anything: radios, televisions, satellite receivers, the cheap Chinese mobile phones that half the city carried. His shop was small, sandwiched between a bakery and a carpet dealer, and he made just enough to keep his family comfortable without attracting attention. He also had a second phone. A Nokia prepaid handset taped beneath the spare tire in the trunk of his old Peugeot. That phone connected him to a world his wife did not know about, his children could not imagine, and his neighbors would never have believed. Dariush had been recruited 4 years earlier during a trip to Dubai. He had traveled there to buy wholesale electronics components, a routine trip he made twice a year. On his second evening, a man approached him in the lobby of his hotel. The man spoke Farsi with a slight accent. He said he represented a European trading company interested in the Iranian electronics market. He asked if Dariush would be willing to share information about supply chains, import regulations, commercial conditions inside Iran. The first conversation was innocent. The second, a week later over dinner, was slightly less so. By the third meeting, 6 months later on Dariush's next trip to Dubai, the man had stopped pretending to be a European businessman. He did not say the word Mossad. He did not say the word Israel. He simply explained that the people he worked for were interested in certain facilities near Shiraz, facilities that required electrical maintenance, facilities where Dariush's skills might occasionally bring him through the front gate. The money was not enormous. A few $100s per report, delivered through a system Dariush did not fully understand. But it was steady, and it was more than his shop earned in a month, and the man in Dubai had a way of making the arrangement feel like a partnership rather than a transaction. What Dariush did not know, what he could not have known, was that he was one of 23. 23 people scattered across Isfahan, Natanz, Arak, Tehran, Shiraz, and Bushehr, all recruited through similar channels, all managed through the same communication infrastructure, all believing they were participating in something small and contained. He also did not know that the man in Dubai was not his real handler. The real handler, the person who read every report Dariush filed, who crafted every question Dariush was asked, who tracked every detail of Dariush's life from his daughter's school schedules to his wife's medical appointments, was sitting in an office in Tel Aviv and had never set foot in Iran. The officer who managed the network was a mid-career Mossad case officer we will call Ronan. He was 38 years old in 2008, a veteran of the agency's Iran desk, fluent enough in Farsi to read intelligence reports in newspapers, but not fluent enough to pass as Iranian on the street. He had joined Mossad after military service in a signals intelligence unit, and his supervisors considered him one of the most careful handlers on the desk. Methodical, patient, obsessive about details. Ronan had never met Dariush. He had never met any of his 23 sources. Everything he knew about them, their personalities, their fears, their family pressures, their access to sensitive sites, He knew through layers of encrypted text transmitted through intermediaries and technology. This was standard practice. Mossad handlers who run assets inside denied access countries like Iran almost never meet their sources face to face. The risk of a case officer entering hostile territory is considered unacceptable relative to the intelligence value, but managing 23 sources remotely created a problem that no amount of caution could eliminate. Each source required individualized communication. Each had different access to different facilities. Each had a different threshold for risk. Some needed encouragement, some needed restraint. Some reported voluntarily and prolifically. Others had to be carefully guided toward the specific questions that mattered. Questions about centrifuge accounts, about construction timelines, about shipments arriving at facilities that did not appear on any commercial satellite image. To handle this volume, Ronan relied on an internet-based covert communication platform. It looked like an ordinary commercial website, a news aggregator, or a small business portal, depending on the version. Assets would access the site from internet cafes or personal computers, log in through a hidden interface, and transmit encrypted messages that were routed to Tel Aviv through a chain of servers designed to mask the origin and destination. The system had been developed years earlier and used successfully in other theaters. It was considered state-of-the-art. Mossad's technology division had vetted it. The encryption was strong. The interface was simple enough for non-technical users like Dariush to operate without training. What the technology division had not fully evaluated was the system's vulnerability to a different kind of analysis. Not code breaking, not decryption, but pattern recognition. The content of the messages was invisible. But the act of communication itself, the timing, the frequency, the IP addresses, the digital fingerprints left on every device that connected, was not. And Iran's Ministry of Intelligence had been building exactly that kind of surveillance capability since 2007. Not to find Mossad specifically, to find anomalies, patterns that deviated from normal internet behavior, clusters of access to obscure URLs that no ordinary Iranian would ever visit. Ronan did not know this. His superiors did not know this. The operating assumption inside Tel Aviv was that encrypted meant invisible, that if the content could not be read, the communication could not be detected. 23 people were staking their lives on that assumption. Meanwhile, 1,500 kilometers to the east, a signals intelligence team inside Iran's Ministry of Intelligence had begun flagging a website that was receiving a statistically unusual pattern of visits from 6 different Iranian cities. The visits were brief, regularly spaced, and always originated from locations near government or military infrastructure. They did not yet know what they were looking at, but they had started watching. And in the world of counterintelligence, the moment someone starts watching is the moment the clock begins to run, even if the people being watched do not hear it ticking. The first sign of trouble arrived not as an alarm, but as an absence. In March of 2010, a source in Isfahan, an air conditioning technician who serviced climate control systems at a uranium conversion facility, missed his scheduled communication window. He had been one of the most reliable assets in the network, reporting every 11 to 14 days like clockwork for nearly 3 years. His silence was noted, flagged, and initially explained away. People miss windows. It happens. A family emergency, a sudden work schedule change, a temporary loss of internet access in a country where the government regularly throttles bandwidth during periods of political tension. Ronan logged the missed contact, sent a low-priority query through the backup channel, and moved on to the next source requiring attention. 11 days later, a second source went silent. This one was a truck driver based in Iraq who had been providing information about cargo shipments entering a heavy water reactor facility. He had last reported 17 days earlier, a routine message confirming a delivery schedule. Then nothing. No response to the check-in prompt. No activity on the communication platform. No signal through the emergency dead drop that had been established for exactly this kind of situation. Ronan flagged this as well. 2 sources going dark within the same month was unusual but not unprecedented. He had managed brief communication gaps before. Sources sometimes pulled back on their own, spooked by a police checkpoint, rattled by a colleague's arrest on unrelated charges, or simply overwhelmed by the psychological weight of leading a double life. In most cases, they resumed contact within a few weeks, but something about this particular silence felt different to Ronan, and he later told colleagues that he could not articulate exactly why. It was not the fact of the silence, it was the symmetry of it. 2 sources in 2 different cities going dark within the same narrow window, with no prior indication of distress from either one. Coincidence was possible. But coincidence in intelligence work is the word you use when you have not yet discovered the connection. He raised the issue with his direct supervisor, a senior officer on the Iran desk. The supervisor reviewed the communication logs, agreed the pattern was worth monitoring, and recommended that Ronan increase the frequency of check-in prompts to the remaining 21 sources while they waited for more information. This decision, increase monitoring rather than decrease activity, would later be identified in internal reviews as the first critical escalation, because every additional check and prompt sent through the communication platform generated additional access points, additional digital traces, additional data for anyone who might be watching the other end. Ronan did not argue against the order. It was a reasonable instruction, given the information available at the time. More communication meant more opportunities for the silent sources to respond. It also meant faster detection if additional sources went dark. The logic was sound in every direction except one, the direction no one was yet looking. In Shiraz, Dariush received his latest check-in prompt on a Tuesday evening. He had just closed the shop and was sitting in his Peugeot in the alley behind the building, the Nokia in his lap, the screen glowing faintly in the dark. The message was routine. A brief acknowledgement request, nothing unusual. He typed his response, a confirmation that he had completed a maintenance visit to a facility outside the city the previous week and had observed a new security perimeter being constructed around a building that had not been there 6 months ago. He pressed send, powered off the phone, taped it back beneath the spare tire, and drove home to have dinner with his family. He did not know that 2 of the 22 people performing this same ritual in other cities had already been pulled from their beds by men who did not identify themselves. 3 weeks later, a 3rd source disappeared. This one was in Natanz, then a 4th in Tehran, then a 5th. Bushehr. 5 sources silent in under 90 days. The pattern was no longer ambiguous. Ronan drafted a formal assessment for senior leadership. The document, which has been described but never published, reportedly laid out 3 possible explanations. First, coincidence, 5 independent failures with no common cause. Second, a single source had been compromised and had revealed others under interrogation. Third, the communication platform itself had been detected, and Iranian counterintelligence was using it to identify and locate assets. Ronan assessed the 3rd explanation as most likely. His reasoning was methodical. If a single source had broken under interrogation, the arrests would follow a chain, one source leading to the next through personal connections. But these 5 sources had no personal connections. They did not know each other. They had never met. They lived in different cities and worked in different sectors. The only thing linking them was the platform. Senior leadership received the assessment, and here the story splits into 2 versions that have never been fully reconciled. According to sources sympathetic to leadership, the assessment was taken seriously. A review of the communication platform was initiated. Technical experts were consulted. The possibility of compromise was treated as real but unconfirmed, and the decision was made to continue operations at a reduced tempo while the review proceeded. The intelligence being produced was described as irreplaceable: real-time reporting on centrifuge operations, construction activity, personnel movements at facilities that no satellite could see inside. Shutting down the network without confirmed compromise would mean losing that reporting at the worst possible moment, with international negotiations over Iran's nuclear program approaching a critical phase. According to sources sympathetic to Ronan and the operational team, the response was slower and more dismissive than leadership later acknowledged. The technical review was not initiated for several weeks. The reduced tempo was marginal, a slight decrease in check-in frequency that did nothing to address the underlying vulnerability. And the framing of the decision prioritized intelligence production over source protection, in a way that violated principles the agency's own training manuals described as non-negotiable. What is not disputed is what Ronan recommended and what happened to that recommendation. Ronan recommended activating the emergency abort protocol. This was a predetermined sequence designed for exactly this scenario, a suspected network compromise requiring immediate shutdown. Every source would receive a coded signal through the backup channel, instructing them to destroy their communication equipment, cease all intelligence activity, and if possible, prepare to leave Iran through prearranged extraction routes. The abort protocol was not activated. The reason the abort protocol was not activated reveals something about this disaster that separates it from a simple story of bureaucratic failure or institutional arrogance. The people who made the decision not to abort were not fools. They were not reckless. They were operating inside a framework of assumptions that had been validated by years of successful operations, and every one of those assumptions was already wrong. The first assumption was compartmentalization. The network was designed so that no source knew any other source. This was true at the human level. Dariush in Shiraz had never heard the name of the truck driver in Iraq. The electrician in Natanz had no idea that a telecommunications technician in the same country was reporting to the same handler. On paper, the arrest of any one source could not lead to the arrest of any other. But compartmentalization is a human concept. It describes the separation of knowledge between people. It does not describe the separation of digital infrastructure. And the communication platform had created a connection between all 23 sources that was invisible to the people using it, but perfectly visible to anyone analyzing the network from the outside. Every source who logged into that platform was, in the language of signals intelligence, part of the same cluster. They did not need to know each other. They were already linked by the act of communication itself. The second assumption was that encryption equaled invisibility. The content of every message was encrypted to a standard that would take years to break by brute force. This was true and completely irrelevant. Iranian counterintelligence did not need to read the messages. They needed to see that messages existed, that specific IP addresses in specific cities were repeatedly accessing the same obscure URL at regular intervals. The encryption protected the words, it did not protect the pattern, and the pattern was the evidence. The third assumption, and this was the one that cost the most, was that the compromise, if it existed, was moving slowly. That Iranian intelligence was arresting sources one by one, working through interrogations, following a chain. That there was still time to react. This assumption was catastrophically wrong. Iran had identified the platform months before the first arrest. The surveillance operation had been running since at least late 2009, possibly earlier. By the time Ronan noticed the first silence in March of 2010, Iranian intelligence already had a comprehensive map of every device that had ever accessed the system from inside Iran. They knew the cities. They knew the neighborhoods. In several cases, they had already identified the individuals. The arrests were not the beginning of the roll-up, they were the middle of it. Iran had been watching, cataloging, and building cases long before it started pulling people off the streets. The staggered timing of the arrests was not a sign of a slow investigation. It was a deliberate counterintelligence strategy. Take them one by one, see who reacts, see which nodes in the network change their behavior, and use those reactions to confirm identities that were still uncertain. Every check-in prompt Ronan sent after the first source went dark was confirming information for the other side. Every attempt to re-establish contact was a signal, not to the missing sources, who were already in custody or under physical surveillance. To the Iranians who were watching the platform activity spike and reading it for exactly what it was, a handler trying to reach assets who were no longer reachable. Ronan was, without knowing it, mapping his own network for the enemy, and the abort recommendation that leadership rejected would not have saved everyone. That is the hardest truth in this entire story. By the time Ronan raised the alarm, Iranian intelligence had been watching for months. Some of the 23 were already identified beyond any possibility of escape. An immediate abort might have saved the sources who had not yet been conclusively linked to the platform, those who used it less frequently, those who accessed it from locations that were harder to trace, those who had natural cover stories strong enough to survive an initial interrogation. How many could have been saved is a question no one can answer with certainty. The internal review reportedly estimated between 6 and 9, a number that represents both a meaningful fraction of the network and an agonizing measure of what institutional hesitation cost in human lives. But in the weeks following the rejected abort recommendation, the question was not how many could be saved. The question inside Tel Aviv was whether the network was truly compromised at all, or whether Ronan was overreacting to a pattern that might still have an innocent explanation. That question was answered in June of 2010, when Iranian state television broadcast a short segment showing confiscated electronic equipment, phones, laptops, encrypted communication devices, alongside a brief statement that an espionage network operating on behalf of a foreign intelligence service had been dismantled in multiple provinces. No country was named, no names were given, no number of arrests was announced. But Ronan watched the broadcast from his desk in Tel Aviv, and he recognized one of the phones. The broadcast changed nothing inside Mossad's leadership. That is not an exaggeration, and it is not a simplification. The segment on Iranian state television was 90 seconds long, vague in every detail that mattered, and accompanied by no independent verification. Senior officials reviewed it and concluded that it could refer to any number of operations, not necessarily theirs. Iran regularly announced the dismantling of spy networks as a domestic propaganda tool. The confiscated equipment shown on screen was generic. The phones could have belonged to anyone. Ronan disagreed. He had spent 4 years staring at equipment manifests and procurement logs for the devices issued to his sources. The Nokia handset shown in the broadcast matched a specific model and color variant that had been purchased in bulk through a front company in Turkey and distributed to assets across the network. He could not prove it was one of his phones from a television image, but the probability in his assessment was high enough to warrant immediate action. He requested an emergency meeting with the division chief. The meeting took place, but not for another 11 days. The delay was not caused by indifference. It was caused by scheduling. The division chief was traveling, other priorities intervened, and Ronan's request was categorized as urgent but not critical. In an organization managing dozens of active operations across multiple hostile countries, an unconfirmed television broadcast did not rise to the level of an operational emergency. During those 11 days, 2 more sources went silent. When the meeting finally occurred, Ronan presented his case for the second time. 5 sources confirmed dark. 2 more newly unresponsive. A television broadcast showing equipment consistent with network-issued devices. A communication platform that linked all sources through shared digital infrastructure. A pattern of disappearances that could not be explained by coincidence or by the compromise of any single individual. The division chief asked a question that would later become central to the internal review. He asked whether there was any possibility that the silent sources had gone dark voluntarily, that they had detected surveillance on their own, and had chosen to cease communication as a self-protective measure without being arrested. It was a reasonable question. Assets operating in hostile environments sometimes go to ground without warning. They sense something wrong. A car parked too long outside their house, a colleague asking unusual questions, a neighbor who suddenly becomes too friendly, and they stop all contact until they feel safe. This is actually a sign of good tradecraft. A source who goes dark on their own initiative is a source who may still be free. Ronan acknowledged the possibility. He said it could explain 1 or 2 cases, It could not explain 7. The division chief authorized a partial response, not the full abort protocol, but a modified version. The remaining 16 active sources would be sent a routine message through the platform containing an embedded code phrase that translated to a simple instruction: reduce activity, increase caution, report only if safe to do so. The emergency extraction channels would be quietly activated but not deployed, and a technical team would begin a forensic review of the communication platform to determine whether it had been compromised. This was the false start. The partial response created the appearance of action without committing to the consequences of action. It told the field team that leadership was taking the threat seriously. It told the sources to be careful, but it did not remove them from danger, and it did not shut down the system that was endangering them. Worse, the coded message sent through the platform required every remaining source to log in and access the system to receive it. 16 people who might otherwise have stayed away from the platform for days or weeks were now prompted to connect, generating 16 new access points, 16 new data entries in whatever surveillance database Iranian intelligence was maintaining. Over the next 4 weeks, something unexpected happened. 3 of the silent sources came back online. They sent brief messages indicating they were safe, that they had experienced personal disruptions. One claimed a family illness, another cited a work relocation, a third said he had been traveling in a region with poor internet coverage. Their messages were coherent, used correct authentication codes, and contained no obvious indicators of coercion. The mood in Tel Aviv shifted. The division chief pointed to the returning sources as evidence that the situation was less dire than Ronan had assessed. If the network were truly compromised, these sources would not be communicating freely. Their return suggested that the disappearances were, at least partially, the product of normal operational disruption rather than systematic counterintelligence action. Ronan was not reassured. He later told colleagues that the messages from the returning sources felt wrong in a way he could not quantify. The language was correct, the codes were valid, the content was plausible, but the tone was different, slightly more formal, slightly less personal, as if the words had been composed with great care rather than written in the natural voice he had come to know over years of communication. He raised this concern. It was noted and filed. It did not change the operational posture. What Ronan suspected but could not prove was that at least some of those messages were not written by his sources at all. In counterintelligence operations, a captured asset's communication equipment and authentication credentials can be used to send false messages, a technique known as playing back the agent. The purpose is to maintain the illusion of an active network while the counterintelligence service continues to map its structure. The returning sources may have been free, or they may have been sitting in an interrogation room while someone else typed on their behalf. The authentication codes were a problem for this theory. Each source had a unique code that was supposed to guarantee identity, but the codes were static, assigned at the time of recruitment and never changed. If a source had been arrested and the code recovered from their device or extracted under interrogation, the code would work perfectly in the hands of anyone who possessed it. Ronan had recommended rotating the authentication codes annually. The recommendation had been approved in principle but never implemented. The logistics of changing codes for 23 sources spread across 6 cities, each communicating through a system that allowed only brief encrypted messages, had been deemed too complex and too risky. Every code change required the source to acknowledge receipt, which meant additional platform access, which meant additional exposure. The system designed to protect the sources had become a system that could not be updated without endangering them further. Security measures that should have been routine were impossible because the architecture made routine maintenance dangerous. For 6 weeks after the 3 sources reappeared, the network operated in a state of suspended uncertainty. Some sources were reporting, some were still silent. The technical review of the communication platform had begun, but was proceeding slowly. The team conducting it had other priorities, and the forensic analysis required coordination with external partners whose cooperation was not guaranteed. During this window, Ronan continued to manage the sources who remained active. He adjusted their tasking, reduced the frequency of collection requirements, and sent carefully worded messages encouraging operational caution without revealing the extent of his concern. He did not tell them that 7 of their fellow sources had gone dark. He could not, because they did not know those sources existed. Then, in the span of a single week in late August of 2010, 4 more sources stopped responding, not gradually, not one by one with days between them. 4, in 7 days, across 3 different cities. And one of the 4 was a source who had come back online just 5 weeks earlier, the one who had claimed a family illness. That was the moment Ronan understood with certainty what he had suspected for months. The 3 returning sources had not been free. Their messages had been fabricated. The authentication codes had been compromised. Iranian counterintelligence had been playing back at least some of his agents, feeding Tel Aviv false reassurance while continuing to dismantle the network from the inside. The 6 weeks of suspended uncertainty had not been a reprieve. They had been a performance, staged by the other side, and Mossad had watched it from the audience without realizing the actors on stage were already dead. Ronan sent the abort signal on the 1st of September, 2010. He did not wait for authorization. He activated the emergency protocol through the backup channel, a series of predetermined shortwave radio frequencies and coded newspaper advertisements placed in a Dubai-based Farsi publication that some of the sources had been instructed to monitor in the event that the primary communication platform went dark. By then, it did not matter. Of the 23 original sources, 11 had already been arrested. The abort signal reached, at best, the remaining 12, assuming they were still free, still monitoring the backup channel, still in a position to act on an instruction to destroy equipment, and prepared to leave Iran. Ronan had no way of knowing how many received it. The backup channel was one-directional. There was no confirmation mechanism. He sent the signal into the dark and waited for a response that the system was not designed to provide. Within 72 hours of the abort, Mossad's communication platform was taken offline permanently. The technical team had not yet completed its forensic review, but the review was no longer necessary. The question of whether the platform was compromised had been answered by events on the ground. The only remaining question was how long it had been compromised, and the emerging answer, months, possibly more than a year, was worse than anyone in Tel Aviv had been prepared to accept. The arrests continued through the autumn. Iranian intelligence was no longer operating quietly. The staggered, careful approach of the previous months gave way to rapid, visible action. Sources who had gone dark in August were formally charged in October. New arrests followed in November and December. Individuals who may have received the abort signal but had not moved quickly enough, or had not believed the danger was real, or had simply had nowhere to go. Leaving Iran clandestinely is not a simple matter. The prearranged extraction routes that existed on paper in Mossad's operational files required crossing into Turkey, Iraq, or Pakistan through border regions that were heavily monitored by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Some routes involved smuggling networks that charged enormous fees and offered no guarantees. Others required transit through Kurdish territory where the political situation shifted unpredictably. For a truck driver in Arak or an electrician in Natanz, people with families, with fixed addresses, with no experience in evasion or clandestine movement, the instruction to flee the country was not a solution. It was a fantasy. 3 sources are believed to have made it out. The evidence for this is thin, second-hand accounts from smugglers in Iraqi Kurdistan, unconfirmed sightings in Turkey, a single intercepted communication suggesting that at least one individual had crossed the border in late 2010. Mossad has never confirmed these accounts, and no resettlement of Iranian assets has ever been officially acknowledged. The remaining 20 were consumed by the Iranian judicial system. Some were tried in revolutionary courts where the proceedings lasted less than a day. Some were held for years before facing any formal charges. The sentences ranged from long imprisonment to execution, and the executions were carried out quietly. No public announcements, no media coverage, just brief entries in prison records that human rights organizations would not discover until years later. Dariush, the electronics repairman in Shiraz who opened this story, was arrested in October of 2010. His wife, Nasrin, learned of his detention 3 weeks after it happened, when security officials arrived at their apartment to confiscate his personal belongings. She was told he had been transferred to a facility in Tehran. She was not told which one. She was not permitted to contact him. When she hired a lawyer to file an inquiry, the lawyer was warned that pursuing the case would result in her own arrest. She never saw him again. His name appeared in no public court filing, no execution announcement, no prisoner list published by any international organization. He exists in the record only as an absence, a man who was there and then was not, whose family was given nothing to bury and no date to mourn. And Dariush's disappearance was not the exception. It was the template. Of the 20 who did not escape, verifiable fates exist for fewer than half. Iranian state media announced the execution of several individuals convicted of espionage for Israel over the following years, but the announcements were vague. No photographs, no biographical detail, no connection to any specific network. Human rights organizations identified a handful of names through prison informants and family contacts, but the identifications were tentative, built on fragments rather than records. At least 6 of the 23 have never been accounted for by any source, in any document, in any public or leaked record. They entered the Iranian security apparatus and simply ceased to exist in any traceable form. Whether they were executed, whether they died in custody, whether they remain imprisoned under false names in facilities that do not acknowledge their presence, no one outside the Iranian government knows, and the Iranian government has never said. Families who petitioned the Iranian judiciary received no responses. Lawyers who filed inquiries were threatened or arrested themselves. International organizations that attempted to investigate were denied access. The 23 did not just disappear from the intelligence map. Many of them disappeared from the record of human existence entirely. Their children grew up not knowing whether their fathers were alive or dead. Their wives were left in a permanent state of suspension, unable to grieve, unable to move on, unable to answer the questions their neighbors whispered but never asked aloud. This is where the mystery earns its name. The mechanism of the collapse, the metadata surveillance, the platform vulnerability, the institutional hesitation, can be reconstructed from evidence. But the fates of the people caught inside that collapse remain genuinely, irreducibly unknown. They are not missing in the way that a misplaced file is missing. They are missing in the way that a person is missing when the state that took them refuses to confirm they were ever taken. The destruction of the 23 was not an isolated failure. It was the visible surface of a deeper compromise that extended far beyond Iran. The communication platform that linked Mossad's sources had architectural similarities, and, according to multiple intelligence sources, a shared developmental origin, with a system used by the CIA to manage its own assets in several countries. The same class of vulnerability that Iranian counterintelligence exploited was discovered, independently and almost simultaneously by Chinese intelligence services. Between 2010 and 2012, China arrested or executed approximately 20 CIA sources in one of the most devastating intelligence losses the United States had suffered since the Cold War. The two disasters were connected not by coordination between Iran and China, but by a common flaw in the technology that both agencies had trusted with human lives. The platform protected the content of communication. It did not protect the fact of communication. And in both countries, counterintelligence services had developed the capability to detect the fact without needing to read the content. Inside Mossad, the internal review produced conclusions that have never been made public but have been described in broad terms by officials who participated in or were briefed on the process. The review found that the decision to continue operating the network after the first signs of compromise was driven by the perceived value of the intelligence being collected, rather than by a realistic assessment of the risk to sources. It found that the recommendation to abort, Ronan's recommendation, should have been acted upon weeks or months earlier. It found that the communication platform had been deployed without adequate analysis of its vulnerability to metadata surveillance, and that the agency's technology assessment process had failed to keep pace with advances in counterintelligence capability. The review also found that the partial response, the coded message sent through the platform instructing sources to reduce activity, had actively worsened the situation by prompting sources to access a system that was already under hostile surveillance. The decision to send that message, made with the intention of protecting sources, had instead confirmed their identities to the people hunting them. Ronan was not disciplined. He was not promoted. He left the agency within 14 months of the network's collapse. The circumstances have been described differently by different people. Some say he resigned, some say he was quietly moved to a position with no operational responsibility. Some say he simply could not continue doing work that required him to recruit human beings into systems he no longer trusted. What changed after the 23 was not a single policy, but an entire philosophy of source management. Mossad rebuilt its Iran operations around smaller networks, shorter operational lifespans, and communication systems designed from the ground up to resist metadata analysis. The era of large, persistent human networks inside denied access countries was over, not because the concept was flawed in theory, but because the technology that made it scalable had also made it fragile, in ways no one had fully understood until 23 people paid for the lesson. The operations that followed, the targeted killings of Iranian nuclear scientists, the extraction of Iran's nuclear archive from a Tehran warehouse in 2018, the sabotage of centrifuge facilities were designed around a different principle. Get in, accomplish the objective, get out. Minimize the number of people on the ground. Minimize the duration of exposure. Trust technology for the mission, not for the relationship. These operations were celebrated as masterstrokes of intelligence tradecraft. They were. But they were also an acknowledgement that Mossad could no longer do what it had once done, maintain a deep, sustained human presence inside Iran's most sensitive programs. The 23 had provided something that no short-duration operation could replicate. A continuous evolving picture of what was happening inside facilities that outsiders could not enter and satellites could not see through. That capability was never rebuilt. The intelligence gap it left has never been fully closed. And the people who filled it, the truck drivers and electricians and technicians who agreed to carry a second phone and answer questions they knew they should not be answering, were never commemorated, never compensated, and never named. 23 people entered a system that promised to protect them. The system failed. The institution that built the system was slow to recognize the failure and slower to act on it. And by the time the abort signal finally went out, it was a message sent to ghosts. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to Hidden Ops. We cover the operations that official histories prefer to leave out.